Welcome to Unit 6. This week we get to study personality. Personality is similar to intelligence as it is described and theorized differently by different leaders in the field of psychology. Consequently, although there is a consensus of the definition of personality for a textbook and for your test, there is not a consensus on traits, the nature of personality, or the stability of personality with different schools of psychologists. This week, it is your job to learn about personality through the lens of the different schools of psychology. Prior to jumping into that, let's look at these enduring issues. As depicted on your screen, people exhibit different behavior in the same situation. The young man in the middle is meditating very calm while everyone hurries past him. To what extent is that driven by our personality, and to what extent is it driven by situational forces and factors? So person and situation, the question for this week is, how does the very concept of personality imply that our behavior in part reflects our personality as opposed to the situations in which we find ourselves? Let's look at nature versus nurture. Are our responses driven by nature or nurture? To what extent is personality a result of heredity or inheritance instead of life experiences? Is your personality similar to your mother's or father's? Is it completely different than your siblings? How do your children's personalities vary despite similar life circumstances and experiences? Different schools of psychology have different thoughts on the nature and the concept of nature and nurture in regards to personality. To what extent is personality a result of inheritance rather than life experiences? Can our personality change over time? You see the little girl on the screen who is acting very fun. She colored her face, she looks happy. Then you see the older lady celebrating St. Patrick's Day, and she looks very happy, she looks very fun. This question goes hand in hand with the previous question. Is our personality a reflection of life experiences? To what extent does our personality change as we grow older? The schools of psychology differ on their answer to this question. Interestingly, the enduring issue of diversity versus universality directly appeals to the concept of personality, for one's personality may be similar to or different from another's. How is my behavior based on my personality different from yours? I wonder how many of you find yourself with the same profile type in the personality assessment. Even if you have the same profile type, I bet your behavior differs at times. How does your life experience impact your profile type? The enduring issues certainly play into the different schools' approaches to personality. Let's jump into the concept of personality and the different approaches. Personality is defined as an individual's unique pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that persist over time and across situations. Many psychologists define personality as what's seen on your screen. What stands out about this definition? The first concept that stands out to me is the concept of unique. This goes back to our question of diversity versus universality. Even if I have the same profile as you, you may find that we react completely differently to the same situation. The other aspect of this definition that stands out is that the pattern persists over time and across situations. Often individuals say that they have a friend or a coworker who completely changes when with a new group of people. According to this definition, personality persists over time and across situations. One's surface behavior may differ around different people. However, I believe this often reflects Erikson's identity versus role confusion. Without a coherent sense of self, the individual's behaviors may shift with different environmental stimuli. I would say that the vulnerability to change is also reflective of the personality type. When we get into traits, we're going to talk about that further. Part of the reason for the differences in opinion among psychologists about personality is due to the approach in studying the subject. Some psychologists wish to determine the characteristics that make up personality. They want to know what the most important characteristics are of personality, and we'll talk about trait theorists when we a little bit later in the unit. Some psychologists wish to determine why there are differences in personality, and we're going to talk about that initially. We are going to study each perspective on your screen. I'm going to talk about psychodynamic, humanistic, trait theories, and cognitive social. The first two should sound familiar as we covered briefly their theoretical approach in Unit 1. Psychodynamic theories. If you remember, the psychodynamic theories were heavily influenced by their founder, Sigmund Freud. You will hear my opinion of him as we study this theoretical approach both in this unit and in the therapy. The main tenet of psychodynamic theories is that they see behavior as the product of internal psychological forces that often operate outside of our conscious awareness. If you remember, Sigmund Freud was trained as a medical physician, so he based some of this theory on physics. He believed he was studying psychodynamics, the study of energy, psychic energy, and the way that it is transformed and expressed in behavior. Psychodynamic theorists disagree about the exact nature of this energy, as we're going to see, but the 5 proposals that are central to all psychodynamic theorists are as follows. Much of mental life is unconscious. As a result, people may behave in ways that they themselves do not understand. Mental processes such as emotions, motivations, and thoughts operate in parallel and thus may lead to conflicting feelings. Not only do stable personality patterns begin to form in childhood, but early experiences strongly affect personality development. Our mental representations of ourselves, of others, and of our relationships tend to guide our interactions with others. Personality development involves learning to regulate sexual and aggressive feelings as well as becoming socially interdependent rather than dependent. These are the 5 propositions that are central to all psychodynamic personality theories. Sigmund Freud said, what did he say? Well, he certainly said something different than what the field said prior to his involvement. Prior to him, the field of psychology, which was very new, was focused on thoughts and feelings that we're aware of. When we talked about Wilhelm Wundt, we talked about the fact that he wanted to know what caused us to pay attention, what motivated us to pay attention to certain environmental stimuli. Sigmund Freud said, I think we need to consider the unconscious. All ideas, thoughts, and feelings of which we are not and normally cannot become aware of. Unlike theories that preceded his, Freud emphasized the importance of unconscious events. He then practiced psychoanalysis, which was a form of therapy, which we'll talk about in Unit 8, as well as this theory of personality. He asserted that human behavior is based on unconscious instincts or drives. We studied drives in unit, I'm not sure which unit it was, I think it was Unit 4, and we talked about motivation and emotions based on Chapter 8. To refresh your memory, a drive may be hunger, thirst, self-preservation, or sex. as these are essential for either the person or the species. Freud regarded the sexual instinct as the most critical factor in the development of personality. He defined sexual instinct, and this is important, as the craving for pleasure of all kinds, and libido as energy generated by the sexual instinct. So he stressed the unconscious, which was based off of instincts and drives, and he believed that sexual instinct, which was the craving for pleasure of all kinds, as the most critical factor in personality development. Do you agree with that? Do you believe that the craving for pleasure drives your personality development? We need to look into his personality theory a little bit more. This is how he saw personality as structured. He depicted it as an iceberg to illustrate the vast workings of the mind that often occur below the surface. He said that the id, in his theory of personality, is the collection of unconscious urges and desires that continually seek expression. We were born with this structure, and it is completely unconscious. Thus, it's below the water, in the iceberg. According to Freud, the way in which the id seeks immediate gratification of an instinct is according to the pleasure principle, which we're going to discuss on the next screen. There are two ways in which the id seeks fulfillment since it's unconscious. Reflex action, such as coughing, to relieve uncomfortable sensations is one way. So I cough to deal with the fact that I'm uncomfortable, that I have a tickle in my throat. I'm relieving a drive. This is based on my id. I want to relieve that uncomfortable feeling. The other way is through wish fulfillment. It's where the person forms a mental image of an object or a situation to satisfy the instinct, at least some, and relieve the uncomfortable feeling. This fantasy may occur through dreams, daydreams, or thoughts around imagined situations. You know, you spend that half an hour after an exchange with someone coming up with a good comeback. You know, when someone insults you and you're like, oh, I wish I would have said. Freud says that's your id doing wish fulfillment, trying to alleviate that uncomfortable feeling. He did not believe that this is fully satisfying. How does the id meet its needs through real life, through the conscious contact with the outside world? This is where the ego comes in. This is Freud's term for the part of the personality which mediates between the environmental demands, the reality, the conscience, which he called the superego, and the instinctual needs, the id. Now he often also uses it as a synonym for self. This is conscious, at least in part. The ego operates according to the reality principle, which is the way in which the ego satisfies the instinctual demands of the id safely and effectively in the real world. We're going to, again, break down the pleasure and the reality principle on the next screen. If we only had the id and the ego, we would be seeking to meet our needs without thoughts of others. Freud believed that when we are governed by our conscious or moral standards through interactions with the outside world, this is the superego, the conscious and the ego ideal. The ego ideal is the part of the superego that consists of standards of what one would like to be. Freud did not believe that the superego is present at birth. Initially, our parents act as our superego until we develop it. He believed that the superego, as you see on your screen, operates in both the conscious and the unconscious, as well as the preconscious, which is that stuff that's right below the surface of awareness. Let's break down. We know that id, that's your basic drives. Your ego, I call it, acts as the peacemaker, and your superego is your conscience. Let's look at how the pleasure principle works and how the reality principle works to shed more light on the interaction between the id, ego, and superego. The pleasure works as thus. There's external stimuli and internal stimuli. Look, it's the same for the reality principle. There's a stimuli either in the environment or internally. There's increasingly discomfort in the id. That's the way the reality principle works as well. The id becomes uncomfortable. It seeks for a way to deal with that uncomfortable feeling. Unpleasure in the id. So we have increasingly discomfort, and then we have unpleasure. Now, the reality principle, the ego steps in and engages in rational thought. In the pleasure principle, that does not occur. There's a release of discomfort. Now, for the pleasure principle, this is through the first available means, whatever that may be. I feel a certain discomfort, I need to alleviate that, the first thing that comes along and works. For the reality principle, we have this rational thought, and what it allows for is a release of the discomfort by the safest and best available means, not the first means as in the pleasure principle. So the result is pleasure in the id on both regards. The id is totally unconscious and operates according to the pleasure principle. Immediate pleasure, avoid pain. That's what the pleasure principle is all about. Immediate pleasure and avoid the pain. The ego operates by the reality principle. We satisfy the demands of the id safely and effectively in the real world. According to the reality principle, the ego uses rational thought, as I said, to postpone the gratification of the id until its desires can be safely and effectively met. The only difference is this rational thought. Again, the id is what I call the bad angel. If we were to operate by the id, we would do whatever we needed to do according to this pleasure principle to obtain pleasure and to avoid pain without regards to, we just operate unconsciously all the time. The reality principle plays off of the ego, which acts as the peacemaker between the id, which is our internal desires, and the superego, which is really the good angel. If you think about it, it's the goody two-shoes. It's the one that always wants to do the very best. Well, there's times where you can't always do your very, very best. And the ego acts as, how can we meet the needs of the id with rational thought, balancing out the superego's desire? Freud believed in the psychosexual stages of development, which we're going to consider after this slide. He believed that our sexual instinct and libido become centered in each stage on a certain body part. Personality develops through the way in which we satisfy the sexual instinct throughout our life. If a child is deprived of pleasure or allowed too much gratification from the body part that dominates the stage, the individual becomes fixated, causing some kind of sexual energy to remain permanently tied to that part of the body instead of progressing normally. So a fixation is a partially or complete halt at some point in the individual's psychosexual development. It comes from lack of pleasure or too much gratification from the body part that dominates the stage. Let's look at those psychosexual stages. The first stage we have is oral. The age range is birth to 18 months, and it centers on the mouth, lips, and tongues. Babies are exploring their world through their mouths. My son puts everything in his mouth. I'm so proud of him the day he put a spoon in his mouth, but 5 seconds later he put something else that wouldn't go in there normally, that we wouldn't necessarily put in there. That's how they explore their world. What Freud said is the baby's erotic feelings, their sexual energy, fixates during this stage on their mouth, lips, and tongue. Now, if I receive too much oral gratification at this stage, I'm overly optimistic and dependent as an adult. Freud also said too much gratification, oral gratification at this stage, leads to an individual lacking confidence as an adult and being gullible. He also said that if I don't get enough gratification in this stage, I'm pessimistic and hostile as an adult, and I might be sarcastic and argumentative. Once you satisfy this stage, you progress to the anal stage. And this is 18 months to 3.5 years old, and it's centered on the anus and elimination. It makes a lot of sense since potty training is core to this stage of life. The child has to regulate the pleasure of holding in or excreting during potty training. If parents are too strict during potty training, the individual tends to be self-destructive as an adult, obstinate, stingy, stingy, and excessively orderly. If you've heard someone saying that someone's anal, that's what this is referring to. Parents that are too lenient are messy. If the parent is too lenient, the child tends to be messy, unorganized, and sloppy as an adult. The phallic stage is 3 to 5 or 6. This stage is marked by discovering the genitals. So when the child reaches 3 to 5 to 6, we talked about this in development, they discover that they're a little boy or they're a little girl based on their sex. They say Freud said that there's a marked attachment to the parent of the opposite sex. This is where things get a little fuzzy, and I'm not sure if I agree with Freud or not. He said that there's a marked attachment to the parent of the opposite sex while becoming jealous of the same sex parent. He reviewed these as complexes, there's more details in your book, and said that most children resolve through identity with the same-sex parent. I get over my jealousy of the same-sex parent and my over-attachment to the opposite sex parent. However, if one becomes fixated in this stage, it can lead to vanity, being egotistic, with men boasting of their sexual life and treating women with contempt, and women becoming flirtatious and overly sexual, or as adults they exhibit low self-esteem, shyness, and worthlessness, and this is becoming fixated at the phallic stage. He believed that the phallic stage, after the phallic stage, that there was this latency where children played with same-sex friends and they weren't interested in sexuality, and this typically lasted from 5 or 6 to about 13. The last stage is the entry into puberty. Of course, sexual impulses are at the forefront during that time. He believed that sexual impulses were reawakened, and that ideally one matured as they went throughout puberty, they would have this mature sexuality at the end, which allows for postponed gratification, sense of responsibility, and caring for others, as opposed to the beginning of the stage where the id is in overdrive and they want to seek that pleasure and avoid pain. Not all of the members subscribing to psychoanalysis agree with Freud's strong emphasis on sexuality. You can hold on momentarily. Contemporary psychoanalysis put greater emphasis on the ego and attempts to gain mastery over the world. There is a lot of criticism that Freud's theory was strongly influenced by male experiences, and we're going to talk about Horney, who, interestingly enough, brought the woman's perspective to the world of psychology. She was one of the first women that did so. Before we get to her, let's progress into Jung, and that's how I've been told to pronounce his name. He contributed from 1875 to 1961 was his life. He contributed to the psychodynamic view of personality. He stressed, though, that the libido represented all life forces, not just pleasure-seeking. He saw the unconscious as the ego's source of strength and vitality or life. The personal unconscious in Jung's theory of personality was the one of two levels of unconsciousness. It contains a specific individual's repressed thoughts, forgotten experiences, and undeveloped ideas. The collective unconscious in his theory is the level of unconscious that is inherited in common to all members of a species. As there is an evolution of the body with shared adaptive features, the mind has thought forms, according to Jung, or collective memories. They're called archetypes. These are the thought forms that are common to all human beings and stored in this collective unconscious. They appear in our thoughts as mental images. For example, the archetype of mother brings up the concept of one's own mother, Mother Earth, and this protective presence. He believed that specific archetypes, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, lead to shaping of personality. Persona, according to Jung, our public self. This is the mask that we wear to represent ourselves to others. So when we talk about having the outward face, I love this concept by Jung, that we have this persona. It's our public self, who we show to the world. At times, though, this public self becomes dominant, and it causes us to lose touch with our inner self. He did divide people into two attitude types. We have the introverts and extroverts. He believed that everyone has some aspect of both attitude types, but normally one is dominant. You will figure out which is dominant for you in the personality assessment. According to Jung, extroverts are individuals who usually focus on social life in the external world instead of their own internal experience. And introverts are those that usually focus on their own thoughts and feelings. Jung also divided people into rational individuals, those who regulate their actions by thinking and feeling, and irrational individuals, those who base their actions on perception, either sensory input or intuition. For your personality assessment, you will determine your type. The thinking person is rational and logical, deciding based on facts. The feeling person is sensitive to the environment, acts tactfully with a balanced sense of values. The sensing type relies primarily on surface perception and rarely uses imagination or a deeper understanding, whereas the intuitive type sees beyond obvious solutions and facts to consider for future possibilities. What are you? And do you agree with Carl Jung in these attitude types and the ones that are determined to be dominant for you? This is one of my favorite theorists. Alfred Adler disagreed with Freud's concept of the conflict between id and superego. According to Adler, people possess innate positive motives and they strive for personal and social perfection. Once again, according to Adler, people possess innate positive motives and they strive for personal and social perfection. Thus, personality is determined by compensation, which the individual's efforts to overcome imagined or real personal weaknesses. This reflected in a personal experience that he went through as a child. He expanded his theory later to say that people attempt to overcome feelings of inferiority, whether that's real or perceived. And some show inferiority complex, which is a fixation on feelings of feeling inferior to others, and it can lead to emotional and social paralysis. At the very end of his theory, he shifted it in a more positive direction by saying that people aren't only seeking personal perfection to overcome inferiorities, but also perfection of the society. I believe that he's the forerunner with this line of thinking for humanistic psychology. So once again, he believed that people possess innate positive motives and we strive for personal and social perfection. And that's where he says personality derives from. Karen Horney was a psychoanalyst, but she disagreed with Freud's analysis of women and the emphasis on sexual instincts. She's not alone in that. She places emphasis on environmental and social factors. She falls more in the nurture side of the debate, if you can think of it that way. She believed that human relationships we experience as children are pivotal in personality development. Once again, the human relationships we experience as children are pivotal in personality development. She did agree that sexuality plays a part in personality development, but that non-sexual factors like the need for a sense of basic security play a larger role, meaning that all people wish to feel loved and nurtured by their parents. So she believed that a sense of basic security plays a larger role in or personality development. She believed that anxiety, the person's reaction to real or imagined fears, was a motivating force, and she didn't see anxiety just based on sexuality. She believed that well-adjusted people deal with anxiety without becoming trapped in neurotic lifestyles because of their childhood environment enabling them to fulfill their basic emotional needs. If not, individuals may sacrifice personal independence in efforts to have security and safety as adults. If they didn't receive that security and safety as a child, they may seek to have it as an adult, which could lead to them not being as independent as adults should be. Others may become submissive, where others may become hostile or withdraw from others. So there could be three responses to not having that security and safety as a child. She says that you could become submissive, sacrificing your personal independence to have love from others and safety and security. You could be hostile, or you could just simply withdraw as a whole. She did believe that personality changes throughout the lifespan because she was more on the nature side. This name should be familiar. As you remember from development, Erikson had 8 stages of psychosocial development. He did agree with much of Freud's thinking on sexual development's influence on the personality, but he placed much greater emphasis on the quality of the parent-child relationship and how they contribute to the development of a secure sense of self. If you remember, when we talked about Erikson's 8 stages, we talked about the role of attachment within it. And that's what this means, that if you have a quality parent-child relationship, it's going to lead to a secure sense of self. And he shifted Freud's personality theory to ego development. Let's talk about the contributions of the psychodynamic theories as well as the criticisms. Contributions are that Freud's emphasis on unconscious influences has fundamentally changed the way people view themselves and others. However, the criticisms are that Freud's theory reflects a sexist view of women because he was unable to imagine a connection between his female patient's sense of inferiority and the fact that in his society especially, females were not considered equal to men. So are you going to feel inferior if you're a woman, so your status is not as high as a man? Of course. Also, psychodynamic theories and views lack a scientific base. They're largely based on retrospective accounts of a limited sample of people who sought treatment. There's not a whole lot of research on healthy people. And then it's difficult to translate these theories and hypotheses that can be tested scientifically. There is some research verification that individuals with eating disorders seem to have what Freud would consider an oral personality because they're orally fixated. They tend to eat and drink too much, heavily depend upon others. We will talk about this more when we talk about therapy and psychoanalysis in specific in 2 units. Let's transition to humanistic theory, which Alfred Adler started. Humanistic personality theory is any personality theory that asserts the fundamental goodness of people and their striving towards higher levels of functioning. Alfred Adler, who we already talked about Abraham Maslow when we were talking in Unit 8 about motivation. You remember his hierarchy of needs. And Carl Rogers we're going to break down. They believed that there is more to life than hidden conflicts. Freud talked a lot about the inside. Life is a process in which we open ourselves up to the world around us and experience joy in living. Humanistic theory stresses people's potential for growth and change. The focus is on the here and the now and the future, much less on the past, which Freud tends to focus on the past. Carl Rogers believed that we were born with innate capabilities, capacities, or potentials, like a genetic blueprint. And that's cited on your, there's an author cited in your book on page 343. Rogers believed that we are to fulfill this blueprint, to become the best of whatever we are inherently capable of becoming. This is considered the actualizing tendency. Hopefully this reminds you of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the highest level is that self-actualization. What is self-actualization, though? It is for us to fulfill our self-concepts, and those are our images of ourselves. So, actualizing tendency, which I just stated on the screen before, is the drive of every organism, to fulfill its biological potential and become what it is inherently capable of becoming. Self-actualization tendency is the drive of human beings to fulfill their self-concepts, or the image they have of themselves. You see the young woman on the screen, she's looking at herself in a mirror. What is she supposed to become? What is her self-concept? You can see why that could be a little bit dangerous. We want to fulfill our inborn biological potential and our conscious sense of who we are and what we want to do with our lives. A fully functioning person, according to Rogers, is an individual whose self-concept closely resembles his or her inborn capabilities, capacities, or potentials. These people are self-directed, deciding for themselves their direction in life, and they're open to new experiences internally and externally. For me to believe that I'm going to be a major league baseball player one day, I'm going to play for the Orioles, that's silly. I have terrible athletic skills. My genetic blueprint is not to be a baseball player. My self-concept is skewed. So for me to be fully functioning, I need to have my self-concept closely match my inborn capacities or potentials or capabilities. Carl Rogers believed that fully functioning is possible with unconditional positive regard, and this is the full acceptance and love of another person regardless of his or her behavior. However, often individuals receive conditional positive regard. This is acceptance and love that's dependent on another's behaving in certain ways and fulfilling certain conditions. If I continually offer conditional regard to my child, he or she may do more to please me and less to actually address the capacities he was born with to fulfill his genetic blueprint. This is all about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Do you hear that? What am I naturally motivated to do, and what am I being told by the outside world that I should do and I'll be rewarded for? Rogers said that when individuals lose sight of inborn potential, they become constricted, rigid, and defensive. They feel threatened and anxious, and they experience discomfort and uneasiness. They just simply don't know who they are and don't know what they want to do or what they want in life. What are the contributions? Rogers discovered that people whose real or ideal selves differ strongly from who they are were more likely to be unhappy. Actualizing tendency is difficult to verify scientifically. These theories tend to be seen as presenting an overly optimistic view of human beings. They tend to foster self-centeredness and narcissism, and they also reflect Western values rather than universal human potential. I mean, it's obviously focused more on, Alfred Adler was focused more on the collective society, but Rogers, who I just presented, was obviously more focused on the individual and not. So for those of you that discussed Japan in one of your discussion boards, how would they approach this humanistic theory, and is it enough to explain their personalities, or is it just enough to explain Western values and Western personalities? We have studied theorists who attempt to explain the varieties of human personality. Let's look at trait theorists who consider the differences in personality in the present. This is often what individuals expect to discuss when we talk about personality. We infer traits by how someone behaves. Personality traits are dimensions or characteristics on which people differ in distinct ways. A researcher by the name, his last name is Alfred, found 200 possible personality traits that were stable, and your book discusses how he went about finding those. They used what's on your screen, a factor analysis, which is a statistical technique that identifies groups of related objects. This was used by another theorist in order to identify clusters of traits. Cattail, I may be pronouncing that wrong, and forgive me if I am, found 16 core traits initially, but then encouraged adding 7 more. Another theorist said that there was only really 3 dimensions of personality. Emotional stability was how well one controls their emotions. Introverted versus extroverted, the tendency to be inwardly focused or outwardly focused. And then the last is how neurotic one is. It's good mental health to the aspect of poor functioning. Let's look at the 5 traits. This is considered the Big 5 theory. It's by Costa and McCrae. They believe that there's 5 basic dimensions, and this is from 2006. This is fairly recent research. You have culture, extroverted, agreeabilityness, conscientiousness, and emotional stability. This model, again, is the Big 5, or the 5-factor model. There's a growing consensus today that these 5 dimensions capture the most salient dimensions of the human personality. The Big 5 dimensions of personality may have some important real-world applications related to employment, sociability, and socialization, and school performance. So these can actually be empirically tested to see if I match this personality type, then I am going to do well in this job. Let's break them down. This chart's in your book. Extroversion is warmth, gregariousness, assertiveness, activity, excitement seeking, positive emotions. It's pretty broad. Again, are you inwardly focused or outwardly focused, but also are you engaging, are you sociable? Agreeabilityness is trust, straightforwardness, altruism, compliance, modesty, tender-mindedness. Conscientiousness or dependability is competency, order, dutifulness, achievement striving, self-discipline, deliberation. Emotional stability is anxiety, hostility, depression, self-consciousness, impulsivity, vulnerability. Which of these shows up for you? Openness to experience, culture, intellect. It's fantasy, aesthetics, feelings, actions, ideas, and values. And there's more information in your book on how this actually breaks down. Cross-cultural research indicates that the same 5 factors appear in other Western and non-Western cultures. So that's good that maybe this can actually be applied to China or Japan or other Asian or Eastern cultures. The Big 5 personality traits with the addition of dominance and activity have been also observed in many animal species. So it can be universal, it's not just Western as humanistic was. In addition, structural neuroimaging studies have indicated that measures on at least some of the Big 5 traits may be related to the size or volume of specific brain regions, and the author that said that is quoted in your book on page 347. Twin studies have concluded that substantial genetic influences are present for 26 of the 30 facets of the Big 5 factors. So we just went over the facets. such as for agreeabilityness, trust, straightforwardness, altruism, compliance, modesty, and tender-mindedness. That's what I mean by facets. Genetic factors have also been found to have significant role in the development of abnormal dysfunctional personality traits. We talked about the fact that intelligence, there's no biological markers, but it appears as if the trait theories and the Big Five in specific allows us to determine one's personality not just through an assessment. We're going to talk about how we measure personality in a little bit. What are the contributions? Easily tested experimentally. When research confirms the value of the Big Five in pinpointing personality. They describe the basic dimensions of personality, which is great, but they do not try to explain the causes. What makes me one way and you another? They reduce human complexity to just a few traits, and that could be dangerous. A five-factor model may not be the best way to describe the basic traits of personality. Let's look at the cognitive social learning theories before we go into how we measure personality. Cognitive social are the theories that view behaviors as the interaction of cognitions, which we studied last unit, learning and past experience, which we studied in the past, and the immediate environment. And you see the theorist on your screen. Albert Bandura said that people evaluate a situation according to certain internal expectancies, such as personal preferences, and then based on these preferences, they behave in a certain way, and then the environment says, oh, you did this is the response of our environment, and then it influences for future expectancies. So I have a personal preference, or the gentleman on the screen looks like he plays basketball. He's got in his mind, I expect to win a trophy, so thus when he plays basketball, he plays well. The environment rewards him with praise, admiration, and maybe even a trophy. So the next time he goes to play basketball, that expectancy can be the same. But maybe in the other cases, he expects that, but then he does poorly, and he's embarrassed, and then he thinks that, oh, I'm not going to do well the next time, and then his performance is not as good. So expectancies is one aspect of this cognitive social theory of personality. Performance standards are standards that people develop to rate the adequacy of their own behavior in a variety of situations. The experience-based expectancies lead people to conduct themselves according to these performance standards. These are individually determined measures of excellence by which I judge my own behavior. So perhaps you went to school as a little kid, you thought you were going to do well, you didn't do well, you had a horrible first grade teacher. She or he embarrassed you all of the time, and so you in turn hate school. And you think, if I get a C, if I pass, that's better than I expect to do anyway. Your standard might be a C. Individuals vary on what is considered excellent, and it's because of these performance standards that come from the experience-based expectancies. Do you see how that flows together? Self-efficacy is the expectancy that one's efforts will be successful. If I succeed in meeting my own internal performance standards, I've got this attitude. My efforts are going to work out for me. I'm going to do well. You ever met someone who's insecure, that lacks confidence? They don't have this attitude of self-efficacy. A lot to do with our locus of control. According to Rotter, he said that the locus of control is especially prevalent expectancy by which people evaluate situations. I have an internal locus of control. It's the belief that one controls one's own fate. That if I work hard, if I have good skill, and if I have good training, I'm going to do well. My destiny is going to be positive. But if I believe, if I have an external locus of control, that one doesn't control their own fate, that chance, luck, and the behavior of others determine one's destiny, then I am going to operate with different expectancies and different performance standards, and I may or may not have self-efficacy. It's hard though, because there's what's called Bander and Rotter believe that people's expectancies tend to fall into a pattern, either positive, like optimist, or negative, pessimist. So the level of optimism or pessimism is linked to numerous, short and long-term consequences. So if I have this external locus of control, and then I operate from this pessimistic viewpoint that, it's not like I control my own fate anyhow. My expectancies are more than likely going to be low. My performance standards are more than likely going to be low. And I'm not going to develop that self-efficacy because I'm not going to believe that I'm going to be successful in what I do because I don't believe that I'm the one that controls it. Do you see how all that works? How consistent are we? Cognitive social learning theorists say our actions are influenced by the people around us. So the mom on the screen with the little girl's mimicking her. Our actions are influenced by the people around us, by the way we think we are supposed to behave in a given situation. While underlying personality is relatively stable, cognitive social learning theorists say that behavior is likely to be more inconsistent than consistent from one situation to another. So, for those of you who believe that people change, that their behavior changes, a cognitive social learning theorist says, well, I'm influenced by the people around us. I am influenced by the way I think I'm supposed to behave in this situation. So even though my personality is stable, my behavior is going to be inconsistent. What are the contributions of this theory? There are key concepts that can be defined and studied. They can help to explain why people behave inconsistently, which, by the way, trait theorists who believe that behavior is consistent across the board cannot explain why people behave inconsistently. And they've also spawned therapies that have been used effectively to treat depression and other mental health disorders. I love looking into people's with depression. It's often believed that individuals do not feel in control of their own world, and how do we use cognitive social learning theory to combat that is rather interesting. We'll talk more about that in Unit 8. Criticisms are, while you can explain any behavior as the product of certain thoughts or expectancies in hindsight, that doesn't mean that the thought or expectancies were the sole causes of the behavior. Personality assessment. How do we measure personality? Since you have had to take personality assessment, it is implied that personality can be determined. But what makes a good assessment? What determines? Personality psychologists strive to develop and administer personality tests that are reliable, and like we talked about with intelligence, this is consistent results, and valid, which it's measuring what it's supposed to measure. Personality psychologists want to measure typical behavior, not the person's best behavior or a type of atypical behavior. And that, I believe, is across the board. We want to measure typical behavior, typical intelligence, typical personality manifestations, typical mental health, not just what someone wants to portray. What can complicate this measurement process is fatigue, trying to impress the examiner, a fear of being tested, and this all plays into the debate about tests in general, but you guys specifically debated intelligence tests. So what are the 4 basic tools for measuring personality? You have projective tests, objective tests, personal interview, and direct observation. When conducting a systematic research on personality, investigators more often rely on structured interviews, which are the order and content of the questions are fixed. The interviewer just follows the format. It's systematic research. Although less personal, this type of interview allows the interviewer to obtain comparable information for everyone interviewed. But then you have this unstructured interview, which is where an interviewer asks certain questions about issues that arise, posing follow-up questions where appropriate. And that's more in a clinical setting. Like I start with a list of common questions, but then I take the direction that the client takes. Generally speaking, though, structured interviews enlist information about sensitive topics that might not come up during an unstructured interview. A lot of times, if someone seems uncomfortable, I'll defer it until later, where in a structured interview, you have to go through all the questions as listed. When I do an interview, you do an observation, a direct observation. Behavioralists and social learning theorists prefer this method of assessing personality because it allows them to see how situation and environment influences behavior and to note a range of behavior. So the observers watch behavior firsthand over a period of time. The advantages are they can assess how like I said, the situation and environment influence behavior. They can look at aspects of personality as they're expressed in real life. Disadvantage: it's possible to misinterpret the meaning of a given behavior. I'm observing you and determining what you're trying to do. It's very expensive and time-consuming. Objective tests are tests that are administered and scored in a standard ways. This is the type of assessment you are doing for our class activity this week. The 16 personality factor questionnaire is one. This was a test, we talked about the trait theorist, Cattell, and it provides scores on the 16 traits that he identified. The next one, the NEOPIR test, is designed to assess the big 5 personality traits. I've never seen that one, so I'm not familiar with that. This one is the one that I typically see. The Minnesota Multiple Phasetic, I don't think I said that right, Personality Inventory. I always see the acronym of the MMPI2. This is the most widely used and thoroughly researched objective personality test. It was originally intended for psychiatric diagnosis. I normally see that one. I did not give that to you guys for this class. I'd love to, except it's expensive. It is not a free test to take. But when I get testing results back from psychologists, I tend to see that specific test used. The drawbacks are this: they're dependent entirely on self-report. They say that peers often do a better job characterizing you than you normally do yourself. And I could believe that. And Funder, who said that, is cited in your book on page 353. And they also say if people have previously taken personality questionnaires, their familiarity with the test format may affect their responses to it. Trait theorists prefer objective tests. For the big 5, there's a score for each trait and 6 facets. They say that this test is used to assess the personality of a normal result. They think that it might have some influence in the clinical setting too. Like I said, though, the MMPI is the one that I see the most. I've never seen the other 2 in the field because I work in a clinical setting. Your test has the influence of Carl Jung and also some of the Myers-Briggs, which is also a test that I see often. These are the 10 clinical scales of the MMPI, and obviously you can see the influence of the psychiatric diagnosis, but they do yield a score. On your screen is an example of a projective test, and this is a personality test consisting of ambiguous or unstructured material. The ones that are, I call it the ink blot test. You look at the blot, you interpret the blot for the interviewer, and they say that this reveals part of your personality aspects. Also see the tape, and this is composed of pictures, and you're supposed to give a story. You're supposed to write a story about the picture that you see. What's on your screen is an ink blot test. Psychodynamic theorists, they prefer projective tests. I need to see inside your unconscious. I don't want you to take an objective test. Tell me what you see on your screen. I'd be interested to know what you guys see on the screen. The accuracy and usefulness of the projective test depends largely on the skill of the interviewer, or the examiner, in the listening and interpreting responses. They can't be administered in a standard way, so their validity and reliability is called into question, and they're not used hardly at all anymore. I don't see them used very often. It's very, very rare for me to see them used in a clinical setting. It's kind of nice though, because it's not, you guys talked about with the intelligence tests about how we construct an intelligence test that's culturally fair and that is removed of all bias. And this is what personality tests would be considered, of not having bias. It's more relaxed, but you still have bias in the fact that somebody's got to interpret it, and there's no clear-cut ways on how to interpret it. So that is the projective test. And that is the end of our PowerPoint. Thanks for your time. Good luck this week on your personality assessment. I hope you learn about yourself. And as always, contact me with any questions. And if you're interested in the, they are there for you, where the pictures came from. Thank you.